Refined question list for pedagogical bridging. Conceptual clarity questions. On translating between communities. Jungian analysts use one language. OPS practitioners use another. Someone might train in one community and encounter the other. What are the translation errors that happen most easily? Where do people misunderstand what the other system is saying because they're projecting their home system's assumptions? How do you teach someone to think in both languages simultaneously without conflating them? This is a difficult question. I'm thinking about it in the context of translating between communities. I'm anchoring it in the context of the language that Jungian analysts use. I'm not as familiar with the language that MBTI practitioners use, though it's built on top of the Jungian substrate, so I think I can manage. But someone might train in one community and encounter the other. So this is actually important for being able to bridge the theoretical gap between communities. So what are some of the translation errors that happen most easily? Some of the translation errors are the ontological primacy of the functions themselves. They don't really realize that objective personality is not just, it's modalities, it's a letter, it's a sexual modality, it's this thing, it's whatever a sexual modality is, it's a modality. They're like, it's just, it's like an adverb, adjectival, it's like an interesting prefix that they're talking about, TE, they're talking about FE, they're talking about FI, they're talking about TI, No. Ontologically, they've differentiated the functions in such a way that the original Jungian functions is an abstract placeholder now. It's an abstract parent. You're no longer able to find this function in a psychological type anymore. That's the claim. The claim is when you're reflecting on differentiated functions as a reflection or an instantiation of a psyche, of a psychic pairing, of a psychic ordering, of an individuation, you cannot find the purely isolated orthodox Jungian function within that psyche anymore. It is colored by its modality, and that elevates the status of the function, ontologically speaking, as being rigid in an ontoclean sense. So the first translation error is understanding that theoretical distinction between a lumper and a splitter in terms of philosophy of science. In this context, we're saying that the objective personality system has split the 8 Jungian psychological functions into 16 at the level of sexual modality. But in terms of theory, this is implied primarily based on the work established downstream of theory in terms of theory, structure, and applications / practice. In this context, we're talking about the applications / practice layer underwriting the theory, or backwards rationalizing the theory from that. So what translation errors happen most easily is that understanding of the functions needs to be understood ontologically as an ontological separation. One is coming from a lumpers and unconscious lumpers stipulation because the theory has not necessarily invalidated the updated Jungian critique of creating a splitter's perspective of the 8 psychological functions. So until there's a theoretical conceptualization from the MBTI community or the Orthodox Jungian community that negates why OPS's functions are not foundationally primary or ontologically rigid, instead of just characterizations of the same function, then we have to stipulate that they're ontologically rigid in terms of ontoclean, in terms of ontological engineering. So that's the first translation error that happens most easily. The second is that objective personality adds a higher order combinatoric. Most people have no idea what I'm talking about when I say this, but it's simple. They're just linking functions together. Normally, in terms of theory, Jung would have said, no, that means the function isn't differentiated, and so it's in a combinatoric soup. But objective personality stipulates that you can have differentiated functions in terms of the Grant function stack. Oh, this is another thing, the translation error. When the objective personality functions are split, it means that we're dealing with a Grant function stack as layer 1. So now we're dealing with bundles of psychological functions instead of bundles of psychological types. The MBTI and orthodox Jungian psychological functions claims that the 16 psychological functions are psychological types. Why? Because we can instantiate them in a human psyche as an individuation. In this context, that is wrong, because once we differentiate the 8 psychological functions into 16, that thereby creates 64 new Grant function stack permutations. But those Grant function stacks are not psychological types in their own right. Those are just bundles of functions. You can argue they might be psychological types from a splitter's perspective, but I haven't seen the theory that instantiated this based on a splitter's perspective and keeping the Grant function stack stable while not including animal functions. But to include animal functions would be to say, hey, we're layering another higher order combinatoric on top of the Grant function stack in order to link functions together. So where do people misunderstand what the other system is saying because they're projecting their home system's assumptions? I would say that objective personality projects onto MBTI and orthodox Jungian psychological functions because they use the same orthography, they use the same terms, but they're not referring to the same things because they've differentiated them at a layer where we can't actually point to a specific. If we wanted to say something about the function itself, say we wanted to say something about extroverted thinking, we would have to pull the examples of every person using extroverted thinking into one big pot and then find the similarities through that. Why? Because in order to find out what extroverted thinking actually is, you have to be able to type someone as using extroverted thinking, but you can no longer do that. You have to type the masculine version of that function in that psychological type. You have to type the feminine version of that function in that psychological type, and you have to collate between individuals that use that masculine version of thinking in that type and collate the feminine versions of that function and then say what are the similarities. But you cannot find straight TE in the functions of in the function substrate of a psyche as an individuation anymore. So where are you going to get the data to talk about a function? You get the data to talk about a function because a function is an actual living instantiation of a theory of mind, of a psychological type, of an individual characteristic in a class of people. That is why most people start projecting into the different systems. That's the main issue with the inverse of objective personality projecting into orthodox Jungian psychological functions And MBTI, because they're using the same orthography, they're using the same names, but they're not referring to the same things. So they try to piggyback on the theory without specifying that they're taking a splitter's perspective, and that you can no longer find that function in a psyche anymore. It's now characterized by their sexual modality. So that's important to note. Secondarily, MBTI has yet to acknowledge the existence of animal functions, maybe because they think it's just a typing procedure, which it may be, but it's still the same thing holds in terms of theory. We cannot instantiate a psychological function because even if they had the same grant function stack, even if they had the same 64 grant function stack after splitting them from 8 to 16 types in the permutation using the Klein foregroup, Klein, Klein foregroup, Z2 times Z2. So this is a conceptual clarity question on translating between communities. Jungian analysts use one language. OPS practitioners use another. Someone might train in one community and encounter the other. What are the translation errors that happen most easily? Where do people misunderstand what the other system is saying because they're projecting their home system's assumptions? How would you teach someone to think in both systems, in both languages simultaneously without conflating them? I would teach them the intellectual property additions that objective personality brings forth, and I would let them differentiate their language based on that to understand when they're invoking a higher order combinatoric, to invoke the existence of animal functions in terms of linking functions together in a way that describes behavioral characteristics, animal quote-unquote actions, animal functions, all of that jazz, in terms of, okay, so what are we talking about? Yeah, okay, it's the same grant function stack, but now we're talking about different animal functions. So how do we instantiate this? Okay, well, we're talking about, for the example that we use, feminine FE, masculine SI, feminine NE, masculine TI. That would be a reflection of an ESFJ, an ESFJ, feminine FE, masculine SI, feminine NE, and masculine TI. There are 8 different animal functions that you can get. Blast, play, sleep, consume. Blast, sleep, play, consume. Blast, play, consume, sleep. Blast, sleep, consume, play. Play, blast, sleep, consume. Play, blast, consume, sleep. Play, consume, blast, sleep. And play, consume, sleep, blast. And that produces the difference between jumpers and standard types, and that produces the difference between energy dominance and info-dominant types. So I hope that does, and then you also have the effect of what it's like to live with their inferior function, their inferior animal function, using that function last, and what that means characteristically that you cannot get when you're just dealing with the ordonnance, just dealing with a static grant function stack. So that is where most people misunderstand the system because they're projecting onto their home system's assumptions, and that's how I would teach someone to think in both languages simultaneously without conflating them. On translating between communities, Jungian analysts use one language, objective personality system practitioners use another. Someone might train in one community and encounter the other. What are the translation errors that happen most easily? Where do people misunderstand that what the other system is saying because they're projecting their home system's assumptions? How would you teach someone to think in both languages simultaneously without conflating them?